Then I will introduce to you our keynote speaker, Elton Ho. And Elton has been a Theosophist for over half a century, more than 50 years. He is affiliated with the ULT Santa Barbara. And he has also been a professor of comparative religion and philosophy, or world religions and philosophy, on many California universities and colleges. And we're really looking forward to your talk, Elton. Why is Theosophia the integral living source of all wisdom? Elton Ho.
Now, you know, wise people who are not so generous save their applause for the end. Sometimes they applaud because it is the end. The timeless tradition of beginning with gratitude expressed for one's teachers is most appropriate today. Whatever there is of value in this presentation is due to H.P. Blavatsky and those great beings who taught through her. To Professor Raghavan Iyer, whose spiritual presence remains with those who had the privilege to learn from him. To Nandini Iyer, who luminously articulates pure theosophy. And to numerous fellow students of theosophy whose calm discrimination and steady persistence have been an inspiration to me for over 50 years. The great master gave only one letter, so rich in insight and implication that it quite suffices. He said, and I quote, that the world is in such a bad condition morally is a conclusive evidence that none of its religions and philosophies, those of the civilized races less than any other, has ever possessed the truth. The right and logical explanations on the subject of the problems of the great dual principles, right and wrong, good and evil, liberty and despotism, pain and pleasure, egotism and altruism, are as impossible to them now as they were 1880 years ago. They are as far from the solution as they were, but to these problems there must be somewhere a consistent solution. And if our doctrines will show their competence to offer it, then the world will be the first to confess that there must be the true philosophy, the true religion, the true light, which gives truth and nothing but the truth. Consider the pointillist paintings of the end of the 19th century. They are made by placing dots of paint on canvas. The dots of various colors remain dots and are not blended together. From a critical distance, the painting comes to life, a composed scene. Of course, if one looks from far away, the painting becomes indistinct and one cannot tell what it depicts. If one draws very close, the individual points of paint are quite clear. But again, the scene as a whole is lost. We recognize these phenomena in aphorisms like, "He can't see the forest for the trees," and the scholarly worry that specialization leads one to know more and more about less and less. Clearly, perspective must be brought to any observation, and this is critical distance. That distance is not some fixed length, for it depends on what one is aiming to see. Such reflection reveals another aspect of understanding, clarity and precision. Looking at a pointillist painting, a certain critical distance provides clarity of composition, but not the precision of a close view. If one wants to understand the whole painting, the conception, the scene, the balance of its parts and interaction of its colors and shapes, one has to establish the critical distance necessary to grasp the whole. The precision of dots requires a closer view. So one might say that these terms are relative. The subject at hand specifies the critical distance required for both clarity and precision. We start with the large view, and then on closer observation, the details become more meaningful. With just the details, it is virtually impossible to provide a clear grasp of the whole. Paracelsus, in his very broad practice of medicine, took this approach. He did not merely examine an ailment and mechanically prescribe a remedy. He insisted on looking at the whole person, the person's environment, including family, community, and even the heavens, before recommending a remedy. And his remedies were not just the herbs and chemicals of his time, both of which he examined in detail. He looked at diet, exercise, astral influences, individual psychology, and patterns of living for an integrated solution. From the second half of the 19th century through the latter half of the 20th, many thinkers were increasingly concerned with the problems posed by specialization. This concern began in medicine, thanks in part to Paracelsus. As more was learned of the functioning of the human body and the diseases that can affect it, physicians began to focus on specific areas. Today, one may go to a general practitioner for regular checkups, but if some serious ailment or malfunction is detected, it is likely that one will be referred to a specialist, someone deeply versed in lungs, heart, eye, digestive tract, and so on. But as specializations became ever more sophisticated, especially with pharmaceuticals, increasing attention had to be paid to side effects. Even while a procedure or drug might alleviate a particular condition, it might aggravate others. As Paracelsus saw, treatment of the human being requires what in medicine came to be called a holistic approach. Put simply, medical science needs to be integrated across the whole spectrum. Saying this is not to criticize specialization, but only to recognize its limits. Both precision and critical distance are needed for effective treatment. The same issues arise in other branches of science. In biology, the attempt to explain evolution without any reference to purpose or intention has allowed for many discoveries. But evolutionary biologists have utterly failed to find a way of speaking of evolutionary development without sliding into some language of teleology. I'll give you a quote from a recent article. The bones of birds are hollow to keep the bird light and capable of more efficient flying. That statement includes purpose, of course. Physicists are struggling to reconcile the perfectly effective theories of relativity and quantum mechanics. Even the so-called Big Bang is now challenged because of the problems it raises, for example, regarding entropy and time. Ask me over lunch. The 20th century has been called the century of physics. The 21st looks like being the century of biology. Both are also centuries of psychology. While physics attempts to discern the workings of the universe without dealing with consciousness, psychologists make it the center of their focus. Yet the spiritual dimension of the human being and the whole of nature remain largely unaddressed in modern thought. This is finally beginning to change. Many scientists and philosophers have moved beyond the positivism of the early 20th century and the exclusive use of the reductive materialist method to address fundamental issues. Dismissing consciousness as an epiphenomenon no longer makes sense to these thinkers, even as some neuroscientists continue to hold it. Some even insist that mind, in some sense, is as fundamental a part of nature as matter and energy are. All this is good, but it is not adequate news. Clearly, what is needed is a much more integrated knowledge of ourselves and the world. This inadequacy shows up in the attempt to build an integrated edifice from outside in. We do not start with the roof and walls and later add plumbing and a foundation. We start with the foundation and build from that to the surfaces, which we will see after the construction is complete. From within, without, is the process of manifestation. And so it is with thought and understanding. The ancients called this approach beginning from first principles. As every scientist, philosopher, and theologian knows, any system of understanding, any line of thought, has to have a beginning. In religion, this beginning might be an array of concepts and dogmas that cannot be questioned. In science, it is a set of assumptions behind any theory. Aristotle, in formalizing logic as it existed in his time, noted that first premises have to come from somewhere. For the Theosophist and the Occultist, those come from the great beings who have witnessed the most universal aspects of existence in their own consciousness. And their insights are compared with those of others for verification. And to understand the cosmos and the human place in it, indeed the human role in it, we cannot exclude much of experienced nature and deal only with the grossest forms of matter and energy. Thought, feeling, the sense of right and wrong, and all the great dual principles, indeed all human experience, must be part of the picture. We will not build a full understanding from fragments, even though fragments may give important clues to that understanding. The same is generally true of the teachings of Theosophy. We cannot stand back and absorb the whole of Theosophia, and not even the sixth subrace will do that. But its forerunners and the great teachers of humanity have provided as much as we can take and use in the teachings of Theosophy. Integral Theosophy requires multiple approaches in thought, will, word, and deed, and each has its critical distance for clarity and precision. Given the complex karmic history of each human being, as well as our collective situation, just what that critical distance is will vary with the individual and over time. As we grow in understanding, that distance changes. As the transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson so eloquently put the matter, we are apprentices to truth. And apprenticeship requires thought, feeling, development of skills, and practice, practice, practice. Theosophia is integral. Theosophy, as it has been given to humanity by H.P. Blavatsky and the Mahatmas in The Secret Doctrine and other writings, show it is the synthesis of science, religion, and philosophy. That is, of all knowledge. Theosophy is neither revelation, nor syncretism, nor theory. HPB placed a significant part of the famous Vedic hymn to creation just before the stanza of Zion in The Secret Doctrine. The part of the hymn that is not included, indicated by the dots, says that the most ancient seers saw the emergence of the manifest from the unmanifest. If we take the whole hierarchy of intelligent beings together, Theosophy is empirical science, natural philosophy, and true religion. And it is the ultimate source of anything of lasting value in these three all-encompassing fields. Yet, as we know, Theosophy is not a subject to be mastered in some academic manner. Rather, it is true knowledge, not just a mass of information. And true knowledge is alchemical, in that as one comes to understand it, one is affected in one's whole being. As Plato so wisely declared 23 centuries ago, true knowing is being. Gaining such knowledge requires not just study, but equally application and reflection on that application. So addressing the great dual principles that underlie and pervade all human existence requires study, practice, reflection, correction, a cycle to be repeated as long as we have breath. In terms of thought, learning and gaining competence in the teachings, we have two models that are suggestive. One is indirectly from H.P. Blavatsky and the other from B.P. Wadia. Commodore Robert Bowen had the privilege of small group lessons with HPB between 1888 and 1891 and left his notes to his son, P.C. Bowen, who later shared them. Commodore Bowen wrote a note on April 19, 1891, saying that he showed HPB his notes on what she had taught, and that she indicated that nothing can be put in words, but that he'd got her teachings, quote, better than anyone else ever did, unquote. In those notes, he recorded her as saying that the true student of the secret doctrine is a jnana yogi, which is the path for the Western student. We recall that the Bhagavad Gita gives 4 yogas: bhakti, the path of devotion; karma, the yoga of right action; and jnana, the yoga of knowledge; and a 4th, raja, which is a synthesis of all 3. Given the mindset, astral, psyche, and karma of the West, this path, jnana yoga, is the best for the committed theosophist. So we should study the secret doctrine and her other writings. As several early theosophists pointed out, careful study and reflection on the secret doctrine slowly affects the mind and brain so that one may become increasingly porous to deeper, more spiritual reality. Knowing that there is as much in this as we can comprehend, and more likely, far more than we will comprehend in this life. Unlike the sciences of today, both hard physics and chemistry and soft sciences like sociology and psychology, and in between like biology, Theosophy does not begin with observations, creating hypotheses based on those observations and assumptions, and then testing to see if predicted results are observed. Theosophy begins with those first principles that the divine predecessors saw and recorded for subsequent humanity. Hence, these principles are at once scientific, spiritual, and philosophical, and they constitute and insist upon the synthesis of philosophy, religion, and science. And they are testable. Like the complex experiments in science today, that testing requires appropriate conditions, foremost of which is critical distance and clarity. So we begin with first principles, and these are the 3 fundamentals. Everything in the SD is based on them, and HPB told Commodore Bowen that it may take years to grasp them. She also recommended studying the summing up to Part 1 of Volume 1, the preliminary notes to Volume 2, and its conclusion. In addition, she insisted that the basis of all thinking regarding the SD should be adherence to 1, the fundamental unity of all existence, which is not unity by association, as, for example, a nation united by collective agreement of its citizens, but united in being one principle, the one life. 2, there is no dead matter. Every form is alive. Every atom is alive, as the one principle makes plain. And 3, every human being, as the microcosm, is the whole structure of existence, the macrocosm, but seen from a very limited point of view, the individual consciousness. In reality, there is no distinction between macrocosm and microcosm, except in terms of that limitation. Given this program of learning, HPB also warned, according to Bowen, not to expect the final truth of existence to reside in the book, The Secret Doctrine, but rather to understanding that it leads towards the truth. To quote her, she says, "Truth lies beyond any ideas we can formulate or express. We should ignore opinions and interpretations, for the path to truth is within each of us, and only the individual can tread it." We recall that the Buddha is reported in saying that none of his teaching should be taken on mere faith, but should be tested in the thought and life of the hearer. The result of such individual effort is that even the brain will be gradually restructured to become increasingly open to ever deeper realization. This is the path of the Jnana Yogi. It was almost 100 years before neuroscientists recognized that the brain can undergo changes, even in adulthood and old age, thank heavens, as one learns. This approach is the first model for studying the secret doctrine and of Theosophy in general. The second model comes from the profound Theosophist B.P. Wadia. In 1922, he published a booklet called Some Observations on the Study of the Secret Doctrine of H.P. Blavatsky, specifically because he was involved with study groups at the time. He noted that many people approach the SD in the hope of self-improvement or in the expectation that they will gain clarity in the direct teachings so that they can teach others. Both, he said, will be disappointed, for the SD is not written that way. We might say that the secret doctrine is a secret doctrine and is not simply revealed in a book. But, B.P. Wadia said, if studied correctly, it will affect the individual in ways that both improve him or her and allow for teaching others something of that bottomless ocean of knowledge and wisdom. He agreed that in studying the secret doctrine, the faculty of spiritual perception is aroused. In his words, quote, "In this study, properly carried on, a particular mental process is bound to take place in which this faculty, spiritual perception, will be sharpened, and so sharpened, insight into all subjects, whether or not addressed in the secret doctrine, will be enhanced." B.P. Wadia said that reading the secret doctrine straight through or concentrating on a topic by using the index is not essential. Concentration with the aim of developing spiritual perception is. There are two elements to this essential approach. In whatever way one dips into the secret doctrine, one should so focus on what is read that one attempts to gain the meaning of what is written, and equally, one should study the secret doctrine for some period of time, perhaps half an hour, every day, preferably at the same time. This approach both develops and deploys the faculty of spiritual perception. Then group study and exchange of views will be useful when the purpose is clear. For the clarity of the group's purpose is what gives meaning to the idea that we are apprentices to truth. In this conference, we will be attempting such discussion, and our purpose is bridging the gap between Theosophy as synthesis of science, religion, and philosophy, and science, religion, and philosophy as found in the world today. This is a high purpose and requires the best of our spiritual perception in whatever degree we have it. B.P. Wadia warns that the spiritual growth of each occurs, quote, only when the teachings are utilized for the spiritual help of others. In other words, the Bodhisattva path is essential to all our work, individually and together. In serving one another here at this conference, the highest purpose is always serving the larger group, which is the whole of humanity. As Commodore Bowen learned from HPB, BP Wadia also suggests an initial effort to understand the SD, studying the Prome, introduction, and summing up of Volume 1, and preliminary notes and conclusion in Volume 2. He added a review of table of contents to gain a sense of the structure of the volumes. And his real test of understanding any subject within those volumes is the ability to express the teaching in, quote, simple, untechnical terminology. Such expression should be faithful to HPB's teachings, not to our own opinions and views. If we are faithful, we pass on and share the teachings of Theosophy and not something else. BP Wadi advises that when we work together, as we will here, we should be attempting to contact the mind of the author. If so concentrated, ideals will strike the mind of the participant, for one has to some degree entered into the spiritual world and sacred atmosphere of the masters, and ideas will come from within rather than from without. To the extent that we can follow this advice, we will begin reading between the lines and within the words of the secret doctrine, and the true secret doctrine will begin to manifest itself to us. Yet all this reminds us, study alone is not the whole path of Jnana Yoga. Our long, involved, inscrutable history of karma, individually and collectively, compels engagement with the world. We must practice what we learn, for that gives learning depth and meaning. Theosophy is not information, it is a way of life, and a way of life that encompasses the whole being of the individual, who is the center of the whole of being itself. We know only too well how challenging study is. Practicing Theosophy, that is, living the teachings, is even more challenging. Those of us who have had the sacred privilege of encountering Theosophy were not so directed in order to win comfort and security for ourselves. Rather, we have been led to Theosophy to be awakened to our real nature and to the world. Raja Yoga is a synthesis of the other three yogas, because all three are implicit in each other. Jnana Yoga, the yoga of true knowledge, cannot go far without bhakti, reverence for and gratitude to the masters and their agents who have given us Theosophy in the maximum abundance that we can possibly assimilate in life and over lifetimes. Nor can Jnana Yoga succeed without the engagement of oneself with the world. Theosophy appeared not for personal aggrandizement, but to face and resolve the great dual principles, one of which is egotism and altruism. And so Theosophists may not be karma yogis, but they must take up the great work in the world. In terms of practice, we have the Bodhisattva path provided in the voice of the silence. We are told that we at some point come to the realization that we must choose between living for ourselves or for the whole, to enlist in the army of the voice or withdraw into what at best is a glorious egotism. But we know that this is not a choice simply made and then put in the past. So long as we are not fully aware of the reality of the one life, we can aim to serve it, and yet when circumstances are challenging, lapse. Even when all seems on track, we can unintentionally, through ignorance, serve the separative self. The Bodhisattva path begins and ends outside of self, of any self we typically imagine in the present state of knowledge and awareness of many, perhaps most of us. And yet, we are the path we tread. For we are each an instantiation of the one life under our unique karmic conditions. The Bodhisattva path is ourselves as we strive to develop spirituality as an inseparable part of the whole of existence. This is the karma dimension of the path of knowledge. As we gain real knowledge, karma is triggered so that it may be dealt with and resolved. The very fact that one learns of the two paths and the unavoidable necessity of choosing shows that the self, the spiritual ego, has reached into the incarnate individual, however momentarily, and changed one's life. In the Voice of the Silence, HPB notes that the paramitas are 6 in number and 10 for the priests. These are the traditional transcendental virtues of exoteric Buddhism. Paramita is a Sanskrit term that can mean carrying beyond, hence a virtue that carries one beyond one's personal self. But the fragment she translates says that the paramita path leads to wisdom, the 7th. But wisdom is one of the 6. Something's going on here. A little later in the fragment that discusses the portals, there are 7. The 4th, viraga, being inserted like a fulcrum in the middle of the traditional 6 paramitas. This alone should tell the reader that the voice is an occult work, filled with hints and intimations that can be grasped and assimilated in meditation, the fourfold path of dhyana. The voice guides a student from the eye to the heart doctrine, the Bodhisattva way. At numerous points, the voice warns that one can slip back. This suggests that the steps on the path are walked again and again, now and through incarnations. Dana, the first paramita, means giving, but expands into generosity. Clearly, this is more than a generosity of means, which is important, but also generosity of spirit, how we treat and respond to others. The whole path is found in seed form in this first portal. While the student will walk the paramita path repeatedly, if successful, at ever more refined spiritual and universal levels, crossing the portal means mastery, where dana is no longer an intentional way of living, but is as natural as breathing. One might think of the difference between learning to drive a car and having driven one for a long time. If you've driven one for a long time, the last thing you think of is driving the car. If you're learning to drive the car, the only thing you think of is driving the car. Crossing that portal makes a big difference. Yet even here, we are warned that it is possible to slip back, and it is understood that the higher one climbs, the harder the fall would be. Only when the last portal, prajna, that 7th, is crossed, is one safely a bodhisattva, and not only an aspirant to bodhisattvahood. All this makes sense, of course, if one thinks in terms of the one life, for in those terms, there is no ultimately meaningful individual existence except as a bodhisattva, in which one's individuality is merged in the whole, separate from nothing, even while acting as a center of truth and real being. Shila, often taken as ethics and right living, becomes increasingly karmically situated right action. One can engage in intentional right action to the degree that discrimination is developed and our old friends, critical distance and precision. Kshanti, patience, is needed once the first 2 steps are taken. At any level, for frustration and failure seems to mount with every effort. The obvious temptation is to be annoyed with the perceived denseness of others when it comes to theosophy. But equally obvious is impatience with oneself. How many millions of years did it take for us to get here? It may take a little while to get there. In the practice of meditation, many teachers have advised not to fight against the random thoughts and images that arise as one makes the effort to concentrate on the highest abstract reality, such as absolute abstract space. Rather, simply return to the meditative focus, thereby depriving those thoughts and images of the power of distraction. Patience is not a passive stance, but an active virtue. And anyone who has tried to cultivate it knows how persistent the effort must be. Hence the fourth step, viraga, indifference to pain as to pleasure, finds deep expression in the idea of critical distance, of not being deflected by the sensations of the moment. This does not mean that one does not experience pain and pleasure, joy and sorrow, but that one is not erroneously redirected by them. In the metaphor of the mango, we are advised to be compassionate to the woes and trials of others and hard to our own, not in order to wallow in guilt or self-punishment, but to recognize the karmic source of our woes and trials and overcome them and put them away. One cannot think of and respond compassionately to others if one is distracted by the trammels of one's own reflected personal ego. Dalai Lama laughs and easily takes joy in humanity, but he keeps rigorously to his path, and his example can encourage all aspirants. Dhyana, as concentration, suggests focus in meditation and in the daily round, and this concentration is not only internal and abstract, though it is certainly that, but includes self-study and focus on what is presented to us in the world, by the world and life. Samadhi, deep meditation, is essential if prajna, wisdom, is ever to be attained. Yet, even if we've taken all these steps, we can find that whatever wisdom we have gained refines our sense of dana, generosity, and we begin again. In this respect, the path can be seen as a spiral staircase, ever returning to its starting point, but a higher, more profound level. We each are the path, and that staircase is both within and without. As our life in the world is refined, tending toward realization of the one life, which is us and all existence. So we are refined within as points of the one life. To the extent that the Bodhisattva path is real to us, wherever we may be on it, it is us. The great dual principles set out by the great master are to be reconciled in us and in the world. Like the three yogas, jnana, bhakti, and karma, which are synthesized in Raja, for the theosophist who would be an occultist, study, gratitude, and action are integrated and integral to one's life. Yet HPB said that the Western path is jnana, and so the secret doctrine was given here for the West and to the world, as the West has fostered globalization and sometimes unfortunate imitation. Sharing theosophy with the world is a task theosophists undertake with a deep sense of mission. Dharma is one of those wonderful Sanskrit terms that has no English equivalent. It can be translated duty, as it often is in the Bhagavad Gita, or law, as in the Hindu Dharma Shastras, or doctrine or teaching, as in Buddha Dharma, and so on. Yet none of these fully capture the richness and resonance of the term. At the most universal level, Dharma is the way of the one life. In each individual, it is the right path to be taken. The theosophical life and the mission of that life includes sharing the theosophical teachings by deed and word, by example and by teaching. As William Quan Judge said, each individual is a center, and that is each individual's dharma. There are those who wonder whether such a lofty task is impossible, even foolish in this world of almost 8 billion people, each with a life story influenced by myriad previous lives and by mutual interaction. But the human being is microcosm of the macrocosm, a distinction that is ultimately dissolved on the path, has latent within himself or herself the very powers that allow the whole of visible and invisible nature to exist. They are the mysterious Shaktis found in the secret doctrine. Parashakti, Ichashakti, Jnana Shakti, Kriya Shakti, Kundalini Shakti, and Matrika Shakti, all synthesized by the seventh. In treading the path, we seek to awaken these powers by becoming porous to the Atmic light that shines over all. In Shankaracharya's suggestive metaphor, we work to dispel the clouds that block the sunlight. When the clouds are parted and dispersed, the light that was always present shines through. To the degree that it shines into the lower principles, it also shines out into the world, even if we are not aware of that. We have what we need. The question is whether we avail ourselves of our spiritual resources. Looking at the questions challenging us in these 3 days might seem to appear to be a departure from last year's conference, where we discussed 3 hot topics: religious intolerance, suicide, and end-of-life issues. And to be turning inward this year to our own understanding of Theosophy. Yet the distinction between inner and outer, within oneself and in the world, becomes meaningless for the student of Theosophy. Realization of theosophical truths is inner, and their meaning is outer. The yogas are always unified, and students of Theosophy are learning to synthesize them within themselves. This is the Bodhisattva path. We are called upon to consider religion, philosophy, and science, what they really are theosophically, and what they seem to be for most of the world, and how that gap can be bridged. Here, bridge is a very important word. We know that the 3 fundamentals are the bridge. But we also know that simply proclaiming them is insufficient to cross that bridge. Hence the original 3 objects of the Theosophical Society, which are the objects of all theosophical institutions, are set out. The effort to create a nucleus of universal brotherhood, the study of religions and science, and the exploration of the unrecognized powers in the human being and nature. All nurture that bridge. The first speaks to philosophy, the second to religion and science, and the third to the whole of the cosmos. This conference is devoted to understanding both what religion, philosophy, and science are, theosophically considered, and how to bring that consideration into the public arena where preconceptions and sensitivities abound. The one life is the root of all 3, and the first object clearly involves the highest ethics if universal brotherhood, even in seed form, is to be realized. So the whole Bodhisattva path is involved in the 3 objects. Bridging the gap will not be achieved only by promulgating the teaching, though that done in a respectful and discriminating way is essential. How we live, which includes how we respond to others who may ask questions, share difficulties, express their preconceptions and even prejudices, and including even chance encounters, is equally essential. Here we will discuss together understanding of the issues involved if we practice dhyana, concentration, and focus both on our own thinking and listen carefully to what others share, remaining open to new insights that may elevate our own. We will be involved in valuable conversation. Maintaining a meditative openness, ideas previously unthought may enter one mind or another. For if we have together the right attitude of gratitude for the teachings and reverence for the teachers, both known and unmanifest to us, invisible presences may join us and spark profound ideas. The one life is not constrained by the visible and acknowledged. Its aspects are myriad, and we may be confident, just as we are each challenged by our karma and lower natures, we are supported by what is higher in us and in the universe, if we only allow it. Thus, this conference may be a joyous and also humbling experience for each one, and both joy and humility are integral to that path we tread, which is ourselves. What then is the point of devoting all this precious time to the theme of this conference? The answer is simple, if we but listen. It is given to the one who is prepared to cross the seventh portal, wisdom itself. Can there be bliss when all that lives must suffer? Shalt thou be saved and hear the whole world cry? Apprentices to truth, in Emerson's felicitous phrase, cannot finally answer that question in the way one who is about to cross the seventh portal can. But each knows what the answer must be at every level of attainment. We recall William Quan Judge's great image of Theosophy at the beginning of his ocean of Theosophy. Theosophy is that ocean of knowledge which spreads from shore to shore of the evolution of sentient beings. Unfathomable in its deepest parts, it gives the greatest minds their fullest scope. Yet, shallow enough at its shores, it will not overwhelm the understanding of a child. We may be hesitant at the water's edge. We may have stepped into the ocean. Perhaps we've waded out a bit, or even have plunged completely into its wondrous waters. Whatever our relation to that ocean, this conference calls on us, all of us, to risk going deeper into that fathomless sea with critical distance and precision, with openness and focus, tuned to the highest, invest in ourselves, and to the cry of the world. In 1888, Jasper Neiman wrote a letter to William Quan Judge. In it she said, quote, "The future of humanity is at stake. It is seed time, and the ground must be harrowed and torn." The future is still at stake, and it falls to Theosophists and all people of goodwill to plant and nurture seeds wherever possible among humanity. Integral Theosophy is the reconciliation of the great dual principles. May we all be worthy of the task set before us in this conference and in life.
Sorry to ask you again, Elton. Do you have some time for a few questions? We have about, shorter than 10 minutes. Are there any questions for Elton?
Interesting that you brought up the dual principles in the Great Master's letter, and that these are related to morality and immorality, and obviously egotism and altruism. But I wonder if you could say something about how the others relate to morality.
I think, that's right. I've got is this on? I keep forgetting I'm talking to myself. I think consciousness, as especially those of us who've trained, I don't know how it is in Europe, but in America, that grew up and had education, we have a tendency to box things. You know, there's something called morality or value. There's something called, thought and understanding. There's something called whatever. It seems to me that without losing focus and without losing precision and all of that, some of that needs to be blurred a bit. And I think from a theosophical point of view, there's nothing that does not have moral implications. And there is no moral implication that does not have its other, what do you want to call it? I don't want to call it just physical presence, but its manifestation. So I've always taken those dual principles as being, yes, they all speak to what I would call ethics, because they don't tell us, you know, like rules what to do, morality in that sense they don't. But at the same time, I think they speak to the whole nature of what, for us, a human being is. To me, in that letter, he's just said, this is what the issues are. This underlies everything. If we don't deal with that, then all those wonderful teachings that have come down to us are essentially interesting, but kind of like the doily on this table, not really relevant to anything. So I think those, and if you think about them, I'm not saying we don't think about them, but look at what they cover, right? Okay, good and evil, right and wrong. Gee, we don't even separate those two sometimes. What's going on there? Egotism and altruism. Liberty and despotism. Perhaps in this time in the world, we're a little more aware of the importance of that duality than they were even in the 19th century, right? I mean, so I don't find, to me, everything has moral significance when I think about it, and also other significance. It's just, it's one life.
Thank you. Elton, you mentioned something that I didn't think was possible. I never even heard of. You said in your speech that great seers saw other great seers. Watched the beginning of the origination of the manifested from the unmanifested. So there are people who were able to actually watch the creation of the Big Bang using clairvoyant abilities. Is that really possible?
Was there a Big Bang?
Or whatever there was.
Right.
I mean, the creation of the physical universe.
What HPB says, and I forget where, but when one of the master's letters, a very similar thing is said, is that I'll use a general term, these dhyanis, you know, many different levels. Some of them were fully conscious and aware at the very beginning of our whole cycle. And that also is a very general term, meaning, you know, many different things. What it says is, rather like we think of something we have learned or we have experienced, sometimes we check that with somebody else who's been through the same experience to make sure my memory isn't playing little tricks on me and so on. Some of our memories don't play tricks on us anymore, they just erase. And that's what she meant by verification, that these seers, even at that incredible level of universal awareness, still checked with one another to make sure. And that seems implicit in that missing, you ask, well, you know, the passage is not that long. It could have all been fit on that page. Why are there 3 dots there? The secret doctrine points to the truth. It doesn't just lay it out. It keeps asking us, you have to figure this out, right? Working with others. And that's what, you know, it's wonderful that that happened, because that's why we can have conferences like this. If the secret doctrine had been a set of lessons and you got a certificate at the end, there wouldn't be any point.
Thank you.
And one last question. Oh, sorry.
I was curious about the idea of the use of the word. You mentioned that in the secret doctrine we're advised to look not just between the lines but within the words. And I was wondering if that is just simply pointing us to, the hidden reality behind the manifest, or if you could say something more about that, especially in relationship to the first question.
To be able to say much more about that would probably mean one is enlightened. HPB, remember that passage which I quoted? HPB says, words cannot express the truth. The secret doctrine is not the truth. It leads to the truth. The implication there seems to be there's something one is to do with the secret doctrine, and so that's why I spent some time talking about various suggestions and things that she made and B.P. Wadia made, and so on, just as kind of initial starts. So when it says within the words, well, she says elsewhere in the secret doctrine, she uses draws the language from Hinduism, the idea that the language comes in levels, and we know what the first level is, right? Brahmavach, the Om, the Pranava, the first. Well, clearly, if I say Om, even very carefully, that's not what we're talking about. That's 4 levels down. What was that primordial vibration? Right. Must be connected to Fohat, must be connected to Mula Prakriti. In fact, is Mula Prakriti Om manifest at that level, quite unmanifest to us? And you start getting into all those kinds of questions and can think about it. And then you say, I just read this word here. Many things occurred in my mind that had nothing to do with my reading that word, but had everything to do with her placement of that word there. So I think that's one way one could look at it. And we're all familiar with conversations with people, and some of us are better at this than others, detecting what the conversation is really about, though the subject seems to be totally different. Somebody says, let me tell you about what I fixed for dinner tonight, and you realize the cook is really wrestling with something with their mate. Psychologists are supposed to be pretty good at this. They better be, or they're not going to be very good as practicing psychologists. Thank you, folks, for your patience. Kshanti is a virtue. Thank you for your virtue.
Thank you very much, Elton. Thank you.